Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into the dim, flickering world of a medieval blacksmith where you wake before dawn and feel the chill of damp stone beneath your bare feet. Outside, the sky is a bruised purple, and every breath steams in the cold air. Your muscles are already sore from yesterday's labor, but there's no time to complain. The forge sleeps in the dark corner of your workshop, waiting for you to coax it back to life. The smell is a mix of soot, stale straw, and iron filings. You fumble for your leather apron, still crusted with blackened grease, and tie it around your waist as the rooster crows. Your back already aches from the last time you hauled an ingot across the yard. Today, you'll be lifting a dozen. It's tempting to pretend you might skip work just for once, but you know you probably wouldn't survive that. Not just because you'd go hungry, but because the village depends on you. If you don't shape their tools and shoe their animals, their livelihoods crumble. It's a brutal sort of responsibility, one you can't pawn off on anyone else. Even this early, you hear the village stirring, someone shouting about missing chickens, a dog barking, the creak of a cartwheel that never gets oiled. You know that today, as heat and labor will eat through more charcoal than you care to think about. But without it, nothing happens. No hinges, no horseshoes, no arrowheads for the Lord's guards. A mainstream fact that surprises most modern folk. Medieval smiths consumed so much charcoal that entire woodlands were dedicated to feeding their forges. And it was common for a blacksmith to have agreements with local foresters or even monks to secure steady supplies. He's meant to be helping you gather supplies, but he's still a half-grown boy who dreams of adventure more than hard work. The raw iron is pitted and crusted with rust in places, reminding you how far it traveled, sometimes all the way from bloomeries in the distant hills, or even over the sea. Each bar carries the memory of miners who hacked at underground veins by smoky torchlight. You like to think, as you lift them, that you're finishing what those miners began. You'll give him another 5 minutes, partly out of pity, partly because you remember being that scrawny yourself. Historians still argue whether those marks were trade guild symbols or personal talismans to ward off theft and bad luck. Either way, you wouldn't mind something to protect your own iron from disappearing in the night. You once caught a stable hand sneaking off with a bundle of nails tucked under his tunic. That lad learned fast that a smith's wrath can feel just as hot as the forge. And if you're feeling generous, drop a comment telling me where you re-listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Your breath clouds around your face as you return to the charcoal sack, untying the drawstring. The smell rises pungent, earthy, clinging to your clothes and hair. You've long since given up trying to keep your workshop clean. The soot finds its way into every crease of your skin. The flames will crawl up the charcoal, licking the iron until it glows the color of sunrise. No one could agree why. Some said it was the constant presence of fire. Others claimed it was the iron itself that repelled curses. You suspect the truth is simpler. Nobody dared mess with the person who made all the weapons. You'll start with the simplest pieces, nails, rivets, crude hinges before moving on to bigger commissions. Your fingers itch to pick up the tongs, to cradle iron in the embers, and to start shaping the day one glowing piece at a time. It weighs as much as a small child, and you shift your grip so it doesn't gouge your palms too badly. Every step back toward the forge leaves a faint trail of black dust behind you, as if you're marking your territory in smudges. You drop the sack near the hearth, exhaling a little groan you'd never admit was from exertion. The raw ingots you bought last month sit in a heavy pile against the wall. Each one feels like an unspoken promise of back-breaking labor and, maybe, a few coins profit. You sigh because you know, without a doubt, at least 3 of those problems will end up at your door before sunset. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You catch yourself thinking of it as treasure, because in a way, it is. Charcoal doesn't just appear out of nowhere. You'll spend hours stacking logs, covering them with sod, and smothering them to bake down into those precious lumps. A mainstream fact most people miss is that medieval forges used nearly as much fuel as an entire village as cooking fires combined. No wonder so many old laws regulated how much wood you could cut. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge over to the forge and crouch to inspect the cold hearth. Ash from yesterday's fires clings to your fingertips, soft as flour, but promising none of its comforts. You know you'll need plenty of fuel before you can do anything, especially since the air here never warms up until well past midday. Historians still argue whether early blacksmiths kept their forges burning continuously, or let them die down every night to conserve resources. You prefer to think they were practical, folk letting the embers fade to save charcoal the way you do. A cartload of green wood waits under the lean-to behind your workshop. You straighten up, your breath catching in your chest. And speaking of pawning things off, you hear the apprentice snoring in the loft above. You turn to the hearth again, picturing how it will look once you coax it back to life. A quirky tidbit that always makes you smirk. In some parts of medieval Europe, blacksmiths were rumored to be immune to witchcraft. A sliver of dawn glows at the threshold. You can almost feel the forge stirring under your hands, waiting for you to feed it. You step outside into the brittle morning and grab the coarse rope handles of a burlap sack brimming with charcoal. There's always something quietly ceremonial about gathering fuel and iron before the first hammer strike. You set about unloading iron ingots next, feeling their familiar heft. While you haul the last ingot, your mind wanders to the cart you saw yesterday rattling into the village one with curious markings burned into its planks. With all the iron stacked inside, you rub your palms together and try to will some feeling back into your numbed fingers. You begin measuring out lumps of charcoal, setting them aside in a neat mound by the hearth. There's a certain rhythm to it, grab way, set down that soothes your mind, even as your back protests every motion. The apprentice has finally appeared, hair sticking up like a startled hedgehog, rubbing his eyes and mumbling an apology. You manage not to laugh, but you do point him to the bellows with a raised eyebrow that says everything. You don't know if there's any truth to that custom, but you've caught yourself doing it more than once, just in case. It looks much the same as it did yesterday and the day before that, but today it feels heavier somehow. Maybe because you know exactly how long the hours will stretch before you can let the coals die down again. His scrawny arms are better suited to kindling fires than maintaining them, and you'd rather get the forge properly roaring yourself. The bellows creaks like old knees as you pull, releasing a steady blast of air into the waiting coals. In a moment, the cold black heap begins to glow from within, little embers winking awake like a field of watchful eyes. Maybe because you can already feel the ache waiting in your shoulders and knees. They think all the hard work is in the hammering, but a forge that doesn't burn hot enough might as well be a kitchen fireplace. He watches your every movement, probably hoping to glimpse some hidden secret in how you gauge the metal's readiness. In this moment, it feels as though the bar is lighter, almost buoyant. You carry it to the anvil, laying it across the wide face with care. A single deep breath steadies you, and you heft the hammer. You smile faintly. In reality, it's nothing more than years of repetition, and perhaps a little stubbornness. A second too long, and the metal burns. Too soon, and it will crack instead of bend. You strike carefully, listening for that clean, bell-like ring that tells you everything is proceeding as it should. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval bellows varied greatly in size and design. Your breath vanishes into the growing heat, and sweat beads on your brow, though the sun still hasn't fully risen. You almost laugh at the absurdity. You've been working in the dark so long, the day itself feels like an afterthought. A soft breeze sneaks through the open doorway, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant baking bread. For a moment, you almost envy the bakers. Their fires are warm, but they don't spit slag or demand this much sweat. It's always like this, like the iron wants to fight you, but it can't quite win. Each impact shapes it, reforms it, makes it remember that it isn't or anymore. While you wait, you check the forge's bricks. One corner has started to crumble, threatening to let heat leak away. You make a mental note to patch it later before it becomes another disaster on your list. You work with measured blows, mindful of how quickly the heat seeps out once it's away from the fire. In this cocoon of radiance, the outside world falls away. You're not convinced, but the thought has a certain poetry to mature labor as a kind of purification. You glance up at the apprentice, who looks wide-eyed, as though he half believes it himself. It's just you, the fire, and the iron always has been, always will be. In some large workshops, pairs of bellows worked in tandem, sometimes even powered by water wheels, while a single village forge like yours relied on sheer muscle. The raw, pitted surface softens almost imperceptibly at first, the dull gray darkening until the color slips into a deep, dangerous red. Historians still argue whether medieval smiths relied on precise visual cues or developed other ways, smells, even sounds, to know exactly when the iron was ready. The smell shifts subtly from dry mineral to a tangy metallic bite. The air feels heavier. You swear you can hear the bar humming under the flame's attention. You often dream of having something mechanical to help, but dreams don't buy lumber or pay the Reeves tax. The line between habit and superstition blurs fast when your livelihood depends on molten metal behaving properly. He scurries over to begin pumping air into the forge, sparing you the effort for the moment. Over time, UVA learned to gauge exactly how much fuel you'll need for the day's work, though you still sometimes misjudge and run short by evening. When that happens, you get the distinct pleasure of trudging back outside in the dark to scavenge more. Just as you finish stacking the charcoal, you catch movement from the corner of your eye. While he works, you check the iron pile again, counting each ingot out of habit. You've heard too many stories of unscrupulous traders slipping in lower quality metal when no one is looking. You tap each bar with your hammer to hear the ring. A good ingot sings clear, like a struck bell. A bad one thuds a dull, disappointing sound that means wasted time and wasted coin. A quirky tidbit you once overheard from an old tinker. Some smiths would spit on new iron to bless it before the first heating. When you're sure all the supplies are accounted for, you step back and survey the forge. The apprentice clears his throat, a small, nervous sound, and you nod. Time to get started. The fuel is ready. The iron is waiting. And so are the countless chores you'd rather not think about yet. You reach for the bellows handle and motion the apprentice to step aside. The rhythm comes back to you. Easily pull, release, pull again. Your forearms flex with every motion. It's a quiet strength, one most people underestimate. As the fire finds its hunger, you feel the temperature in the workshop climb. You grab your long-handled tongs and ease the first iron bar into the heart of the blaze. Your apprentice hovers close by, eager but hesitant. You shift your grip on the tongs, lifting the glowing iron free of the forge. The first strike lands true, sending a reverberation all the way through your spine. A fringe tidbit you once heard from an itinerant priest. Some believed each strike of the hammer echoed in the spiritual world, chasing away evil spirits. After a dozen strikes, you return the iron to the coals and let it soak up more heat. Behind you, the rooster crows again, and the first rays of morning slant across the yard. You lift the hammer again as the iron reaches that perfect temperature, halfway between fierce orange and white. This is when the work matters most. The apprentice finally dares to speak, asking if you ever get tired of it. You don't answer right away. Not because you, Dan T., have an answer, but because the question itself feels too big to fit in the narrow space between hammer blows. Each blow feels almost automatic now, a conversation you've been having with iron since you were little more than a boy. Still, even the simplest shaping demands your focus. The metal resists and yields by turns, testing whether you're paying attention. You just nod once and keep striking. You fall into the rhythm, the hammer rising and falling in a steady dance that's older than memory. This one is heavier, and you have to adjust your stance to swing properly. You decide to share the story, partly to caution him and partly to fill the quiet. You tell him how you thought you'd ruined your hand forever, and how your master had simply grunted, handed you a rag, and told you to get back to work before the iron cooled. Soon enough, the first customer will appear, waving some broken hinge or bent plow blade. But for now, it's just you and the glow of the forge. You pause a moment, letting the question hang in the smoky air. You've come to think of these first strikes as the true start of the day, more real than sunrise. Everything before was just preparation. This is the work itself, the shaping of stubborn metal into something useful, something that will outlast you by decades, maybe centuries. Then you tell him the truth. Sometimes you do. You work on letting that idea carry you through the ache in your shoulders and the steady, endless heat. You lean your hammer against the anvil and allow yourself a small, triumphant breath. This is just the first of many pieces you'll make today, but finishing any task feels like a victory when the forge seems determined to wear you down to nothing. You dream of flames that never go out and iron that never cools. You know better than to try stretching too much. The sudden shock of cold air on hot skin makes the muscles clench even tighter. Inside is a heel of coarse rye bread, a little wheel of hard cheese, and a wooden spoon for your porridge. You try not to think too much about how meager it looks. You're not alone. Most villagers make do with rations, no finer, a mainstream fact. Medieval blacksmiths earned a respectable place in society, but rarely enough silver to live lavishly. The work was constant, the income just enough to keep your family fed and the forge stocked. Instead, you busy yourself with the next ritual. Fireside breakfast. You dream of hammering long past when your body gives out. It's not exactly a nightmare, but it's not a comfort either. He looks horrified, but you can see a glimmer of respect there, too. As you do, you catch sight of a pale scar across your left thumb, the thin white reminder of the day you slipped and caught the edge of hot iron instead of the tongs. It's just a cut-down barrel with a cushion of folded rags, but you cherish this minute of rest while the metal heats. Your shoulders already feel like they're made of lead. You know better than to think they'll loosen up as the day goes on. If anything, the ache will deepen until you can hardly lift your arms. Historians still argue whether smiths wore protective gloves regularly or only during certain processes. UVA never done it yourself seems more likely to make your apprentice think UVA gone mad. But you can deny there are days the fire seems to have a mind of its own. You can attest that bare hands, calloused and numb, are often more practical for delicate tasks. The color is perfect, the fierce, luminous orange that means it's ready to be coaxed into shape. You take your time aligning it on the anvil, because a single careless strike at this stage could ruin the whole piece. Gloves just get in the way when you need to feel the metal's shifting heat. You can feel every strike echo through your joints, all the way down to your ankles, braced against the packed dirt floor. He's clumsy with the timing, but he's trying, and you resist the urge to snap at him for letting the fire flicker unevenly. Instead, you gesture for him to steady his pace. You remember well enough how it felt to be so eager to please, only to mess up under your master's watchful eye. Your master used to say you, Dan T, truly no iron, until UVA had it ring your bones like a bell. Back then, you thought he was just trying to scare you. Now you know he was simply telling the truth. Today you reshaping crude iron bars into something useful. Long rods that will be split into smaller pieces for nails and hinges. They're nothing fancy, but every farm and cottage around depends on these mundane things more than they realize. A mainstream fact many forget. In medieval villages, the blacksmith didn't just make weapons or horseshoes. Almost every household relied on your craft, from door latches to cooking spits. Without you, life would stall in 100 small ways. The forge hisses behind you as the apprentice works the bellows again. You lay the iron aside to cool, then lift the next bar. Your apprentice eyes the scar with a morbid fascination. You set the iron back into the forge and turn to your small hearthside stool. A quirky tidbit you once read on a merchant's scrap of parchment. Some smiths believed that spitting into the fire after every completed piece would feed the forge's hunger so it didn't turn spiteful. Outside, the lane is starting to come alive. You hear the muffled clatter of carts rolling over the stones, and the lowing of cattle being driven to pasture. You stand again, joints popping like overworked hinges themselves, and retrieve the bar. As you raise the hammer, the apprentice asks in a timid voice whether you ever dream about the forge. You bring the hammer down, and the impact sings through the workshop. The sound is satisfying, almost cleansing. For all its drudgery, there's a quiet pride in that thought, like knowing you re part of an unbroken line, stretching back to when the first smiths figured out how to trick fire into giving up iron at last. You ease the bar aside to cool fully, the newly flattened shape gleaming like a promise in the half-light. The ache in your shoulders spreads up your neck in slow pulses. You pull a cloth bundle from the corner and unfold it on your battered stool. The apprentice eyes your breakfast as though he'd rather pretend he isn't hungry. You sigh and break the bread in half, handing him the bigger piece. He hesitates whether out of pride or uncertainty, and then takes it with a mumbled thanks. You settle onto the stool, the warm forge at your back, taking the chill out of the early morning. As you chew, you flick stray sparks away from your porridge with the edge of your spoon. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths often traded their work for goods in kind rather than coin. You raise a hand in return without standing, feeling how your knees protest every movement. Once you would have leaped to your feet, eager to show any passerby that you were ready for work. Now you let them come to you. The hammer's handle is worn smooth, the tongs slightly warped. The fire crackles and shifts, sparks whirling up in little constellations. You feel the heat tighten the skin of your face, but you don't look away. Watching the iron change color is the only way to be sure you catch that perfect moment when it's ready to shape. The iron darkens, then brightens in steady pulses, waiting to be transformed, and you feel the familiar sense of purpose settle in your chest. Whatever else this day brings, you know you'll meet it here, with fire and hammer in hand. You make a mental note to reforge them when you can spare the time. A shout drifts in through the open doorway, brisk, commanding, unmistakably noble. Each one had to be shaped to the specific hoof, a painstaking process that often left the smith wishing he'd chosen an easier trade. Today, you're no different. You motion to the apprentice, who scurries to the forge to fetch a fresh bar of iron. You sigh, setting down the tongs as a pair of boots crunch across the threshold. The gelding is magnificent, broad-chested, glossy black, and radiating an air of contempt for anyone who isn't wearing spurs. The apprentice has set the iron in the coals, and you begin working the bellows again, coaxing the fire higher until the metal glows. You don't bother to answer. You've worked for the manor long enough to know that the expectations are always absurd. Historians still argue whether the nobility ever understood how much time it took to make even simple ironwork. From where you're standing, you'd wager they didn't and still don't. The stable hand hovers impatiently, arms crossed over his chest. The apprentice backs away instinctively, and you're glad he has at least learned that much. You begin shaping the rough outline of the shoe, striking slow and steady. Every hammerfall sends a spray of sparks into the half-dark. You give his flank a gentle pat and crouch to inspect the bare hoof. Sure enough, the old nails have left ragged holes you'll have to clean before fitting anything new. The iron is bent nearly double, the nails sheared clean. You can't help the skeptical lift of your brow. What was he doing dancing? A reel on cobblestones. The stable hand doesn't laugh. They rarely do when they're under orders. Voices call back and forth. The hens cluck indignantly at some unseen threat, and you catch the smell of baking bread drifting from the nearest cottage. Only if I do, you say, and you mean it. The fire has become part of you, as essential as the air in your lungs. For a moment, you almost wish you were the baker-warm hearth, soft dough, no risk of searing slag. But then you look at the iron and remember why you never wanted any other life. A quirky tidbit you learned from a traveling smith. Some old forges held naming ceremonies for their most trusted tools, as though giving them a name would keep them loyal. Behind him, tethered to a post just out of sight, you can already hear the restless stamping of a destrier who clearly resents being out of his stall before breakfast. The stable hand nods at you like he owns the place and holds up the shoe. His lordship's gelding through this last night needs replacing. Now, you've never gone that far, but there are days you swear your hammer has a personality stubborn as any mule in the village. If someone wants to hire your hammer, they can walk the extra steps. You know from experience that barter is more common than most scribes like to record. The forge breathes behind you, an animal waiting to be fed again. He jumps to obey, nearly tripping over the sack of charcoal. You can't help a wry smile. No matter how many times you warn him to watch his feet, he manages to find a way to stumble. You rise, joints popping, and glance over at the apprentice. He's watching the flames as though they might whisper secrets if he stares long enough. Plenty of your neighbors can't afford to pay outright, but you can't let them go without nails or hinges. In the end, you take whatever they can spare: eggs, grain, sometimes even a bushel of onions. There's nothing quite like the taste of ash in your food, a seasoning no medieval cookbook bothers to mention. The bread goes down dry, and you swallow hard, thinking again about the cart of provisions you saw arriving yesterday. A cart rumbles by the open doorway, the driver calling out a greeting you can barely hear over the creaking wheels. You finish the last of the bread and rub the crumbs from your palms. Fetch the next bar, you tell him, your voice rough with the morning's soot. While he fumbles with the tongs, you take a moment to check your tools. At last, the apprentice hands you the next bar, and you set it carefully into the coals. Outside, the lane has truly come to life now. The apprentice clears his throat again. He asks if you think the forge will ever wear out completely. You shake your head. You reach for the bellows, ready to begin the next round. You, Dan T., get long to savor that moment of purpose before the first real interruption of the day. In strides one of the Lord's stable hands, clutching a heavy iron horseshoe. You study the shoe in his outstretched hand, a mainstream fact that might surprise you. Horseshoes were far from uniform. While the apprentice gets the material heating, you step outside to look at the horse himself. You straighten, feeling the pull in your back, and return to the forge. His lordship expects this done before midday, he says pointedly. When the bar reaches the right temperature, you pull it free with the tongs and lay it across the anvil. A fringe tidbit you heard from an old drover. Some horsemen believed that a smith could curse a shoe so the horse would never run straight again. You've never been asked to try it, but you suspect a few rivals wouldn't mind if you did. A rushed shoe is a dangerous shoe, and if that destrier throws another one, you'll be seeing this same stable hand in another day or two, probably with even more complaints. The stable hand clears his throat. You pretend you didn't hear it. You have no intention of working faster. The apprentice brings you the punch to pierce nail holes, and you set it carefully on the hot iron, tapping until each cavity opens clean. It's as fine a piece as any you've made this month's, sturdy, balanced, the holes clean and even. You hand it to the stable hand without a word. He takes it, nods curtly, and disappears out the door to shoe the horse himself. Slowly, the iron yields to your will. You bend it into the curve that will cradle the hoof, shaping the heels and narrowing the toe. The shoe must be perfect. There's no second chance when a lord's animal is involved. The forge's heat has become oppressive, sweat trickling down your spine, but you keep going. The forge still pulses behind you like a second sun, relentless and insistent. You'd like nothing more than to sit and catch your breath, but there's already a line forming outside. You can see them through the doorway, a procession of peasants clutching everything from dented pots to snapped plowshares. It's clean enough to mend, but you can already hear the others shifting impatiently behind him. A mainstream fact: medieval blacksmiths were part craftsman, part mediator. The apprentice hovers near the forge, clearly hoping you won't send him to deal with the customers. You don't blame him. It takes years to learn how to promise everything while guaranteeing nothing. While you wait, the farmer launches into a litany of complaints about the harvest, the weather, and his brother-in-law's borrowing habits. You nod occasionally, though your thoughts are elsewhere. You're tallying how many more repairs you can finish before your shoulders refuse to cooperate. Every neighbor wants their repair done first, convinced their need is the most urgent. Sparks scatter in bright arcs, some landing on your sleeve, where they smolder briefly before dying. You're used to the sting of hot cinders against your skin. They're just another part of the trade. UVA spent more hours than you can count, soothing ruffled pride as much as fixing broken iron. You suspect she half believes the old tales about smiths working spells into the iron. The farmer thanks you and counts out a few grimy coins, barely enough to cover your effort, but you know he can't spare more. You take the money without comment. Some debts are measured in goodwill rather than silver. A quirky tidbit you once overheard in the tavern: some claimed a blacksmith could forge a lock that would only open for the rightful owner. You've never tried anything of the sort, but it's an amusing notion. At last, you quench the shoe in the trough, the hiss of steam filling the workshop. You lift it free, inspecting your work. A woman comes forward with a sagging hinge wrapped in cloth. Your hammer rises and falls, each impact wearing you down a little further. The apprentice fetches tools and refuels the forge when you nod. He's learning, you think slowly, but learning. Behind her, a young man clutches a twisted hook, and so it goes. A whole morning of small disasters laid at your feet. The last customer departs, trailing thanks and promises to send payment when the grain comes in. You lean both hands on the anvil and close your eyes for a moment. The forge's heat has soaked into your bones, making them feel heavy and brittle all at once. The apprentice returns with a bucket of water, which you set aside for later, more likely for dousing your own thirst than for any cooling work. You wipe your hands on your apron and wave the first villager inside. From where you stand, it certainly feels true. Your workshop has become a crossroads, part gossip exchange, part confession booth. People come here not only to get their tools mended, but to unburden themselves. You watch him go, feeling the last of your patience trickle away with him. He sets it down on the anvil with a clank. "Morning, she finally gave up on me," he says, as though the tool were an old dog that died in its sleep. The apprentice lets out the breath he was holding, and you almost smile at the relief on his face. Horses will throw shoes, lords will demand the impossible, and you'll keep coaxing iron into shape, one stubborn bar at a time. He hurries off gratefully, eager for any task that isn't standing in the path of noble irritation. Outside, the village carries on, oblivious to the small dramas in your workshop. You can hear children laughing in the lane, the creak of wagon wheels, the chatter of women hauling buckets from the well. Fetch some water, you tell him, voice hoarse from the forge's dry air. You lean against the anvil, letting the moment stretch. It occurs to you, as you rub a hand over your aching forearm, that tomorrow will likely be exactly the same. You watch the steam curl up from the quenching trough, feeling it dampen your face for just a heartbeat before it disappears. With a sigh, you stand straight again. Your knees creak their disapproval. He's a gaunt farmer you've known half your life, carrying a hoe that looks more rust than iron. You pick it up, inspecting the jagged break along the blade's edge. You tell the farmer to wait and motion to the next in line. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths really were the social center of a village, or whether that's just romantic hindsight. You pick up the broken hoe and set it in the coals to heat. The iron begins to glow. You draw it out and start shaping the fracture back into alignment. The woman with the hinge waits her turn, eyeing the forge with something between awe and suspicion. You finish repairing the hoe and plunge it into the quenching trough. One by one, you work through the line, fixing the hinge, straightening the hook, reforging a broken latch. Eventually, the workshop grows quiet again. Outside, the sun is climbing higher. The air smells of trampled straw, warm earth, and the faint tang of manure from the lane. You give a great deal to trade places with the man leading that ox cart past your door. His burdens are simpler, at least. But you know you wouldn't. This is the life you chose, or perhaps the life that chose you. The apprentice clears his throat, startling you from your thoughts. He gestures toward the forge, where the coals are sinking low. You nod and reach for the bellows. There's no end to the queue of things needing heat and iron. You can hear a rooster crowing again. Heat. The apprentice watches, eyes fixed on your hands. Cauldrons don't forgive impatience. They buckle and split if you rush. You can tell he wants to ask how you know when a pot can be saved, and when it's better to scrap it. Two women are talking as they pass something about a rival smith in the next village over. Supposedly, he's started using magic water to quench his iron, claiming it makes his work stronger. A boy of no more than 8 or 9 peers in, clutching a bent nail in one grubby fist. You wave him closer. He steps carefully over the threshold, as if expecting the forge itself to lunge at him. You snort softly. A quirky tidbit, indeed. Some smiths swore by all manner of nonsense, quenching in brine, in blood, even in ale. You'd think you'd given him a sword, he says. No matter how many hours you spend here, no matter how many things you mend or make, there's always more waiting. You grin, wiping your hands on your apron. To him, that nail is as good as any sword, you reply. You've tried most of it at least once, and found that, in the end, a steady hand and good coal matter more than any secret ingredient. It always feels a little like healing a wound, slow, delicate, never certain until the end whether it will hold. Historians still argue whether apprentices were formally taught every technique or were expected to learn by observation and trial. You suspect it was always a little of both. You point to the hairline fracture, glimmering in the orange heat. See there? If you hammer too hard, it'll split clean through. He nods solemnly, and you suspect he'll be dreaming about cracked cauldrons tonight. Satisfied, you set it aside and pick up the rivets. You'll need to mend a crack near the base. You glance up through the doorway and catch sight of a peddler Esprite striped canopy bobbing past. A mainstream fact, Peddlers were often the only link between isolated villages and the wider world, carrying gossip, trinkets, and the occasional precious tool. You've bartered with more than a few in your times, sometimes for things you needed, sometimes just for something different to break the monotony. As you sort through them, you feel a small pang of envy for the apprentice how new everything still must seem to him. You can tell he's eager to try his hand at something more complex than hauling fuel or sweeping the floor. But you're not ready to trust him with a repair this finicky. Maybe in another year or two, maybe. You've been at this so long that even the surprises feel familiar. With the boy watching, you set the nail across the anvil and tap it back into true. You watch him disappear down the lane, and despite yourself, you feel a small flicker of satisfaction. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were respected or merely tolerated, but you think you've earned at least a little of the former. It takes all of 10 seconds. You hand it back, and he stares at it as though you just performed a miracle. A breeze pushes through the doorway, stirring the sweat-darkened hair on your forehead. For just a breath, it feels almost cool. The bellows wheeze as you pull, the forge flaring back to life with a greedy roar. He holds out the nail, eyes huge with hope. You watch the coals settle into their familiar inferno glow, and for a moment you feel almost relieved. He struggles with the weight, nearly dropping it on his toes. You can feel the places where the iron has thinned from years of cooking. A mainstream fact. Iron cookware was a treasure in any household, and even a modest pot could outlast generations if it was mended properly. You suspect this one has been in the Reeves family longer than he'd ever admit. You pretend not to notice, partly to spare his pride, partly because you remember how humiliating it feels to be corrected for every clumsy move. At least when the fire is burning properly, you know exactly what to expect. It's the people who are unpredictable. You motion to the apprentice to fetch the next project from the corner, a dented cauldron you promised to patch for the Reeves wife. He sets the cauldron on the workbench, and you run your hand over the battered rim. Outside, the village seems to have settled into a slower rhythm. You set to work cleaning the rim of the cauldron, scraping away layers of soot and old grease with a chisel. After the rim is clean, you take up the hammer and begin tapping the metal back into shape. Each strike is careful, more coaxing than force. While you work, you hear gossip drifting through the open door. You pause to check the cauldron's shape, running your palm along the rim again. A soft shuffle at the doorway catches your attention. "Master Blacksmith," he says in a voice like a whisper, "my DA said if I brought this, you'd straighten it for me. You take it gently. It's nothing, a mere scrap butt." You can see how important it feels to him. "Thank you, sir," he breathes, and bolts for the door. The apprentice lets out a laugh when the boy is gone. You turn back to the cauldron, but for a moment you let your gaze linger on the forge. The flames snap and twist, tireless as ever. You set your hands to work again, feeling the familiar pull in your arms and the quiet certainty that this is where you belong. You ease the cauldron into the forge, watching the crack along its base soften and darken as the iron yields to the heat. The apprentice stands to one side, wiping sweat from his brow and eyeing the tools arrayed on the bench. Outside, you hear a pair of cartwheels rattling over the stones. The cauldron is ready. You lift it carefully from the coals and lay it belly up across the anvil. The apprentice leans in to watch. You begin working in small, measured strikes. The the hammer barely tapping the iron into alignment. Each blow feels like it takes an age, but the crack eases closed millimeter by millimeter. This is the part you enjoy most, when the iron finally cooperates and you can almost pretend it as grateful. Historians still argue whether medieval smiths used fluxes as often as modern reenactors claim some say they did. Others that it was a rare luxury. If you treated it well, it would serve you faithfully. You allow him this small victory. He needs to see what's possible if he sticks with the craft long enough. If you were careless or cruel, it would fail you at the worst moment. Watching the cauldron come back together, you almost believe it. You close your eyes and let the heat and moisture soak into your skin, feeling the ache in your joints fade by half a degree. Days like this are common enough, one job flowing into the next, with barely time to drink water in between. You have a little powdered sand in a clay jar for just this purpose, and you sprinkle a pinch over the seam to help the metal flow. You wonder if he knows yet how little romance there is in this trade. The stories always speak of blacksmiths as heroes, forging legendary swords and enchanted locks. In truth, most days you mend broken hinges and straighten bent nails. The cauldron hisses softly as the sand melts. You feel the tension in your shoulders ease just a little. The edge is nicked in half a dozen places, and there's a slight bend near the tip that will take more than a whetstone to correct. If you can, he says, as though you might not be up to the task. You feel a tiny flare of irritation, but swallow it down. He'll learn soon enough. The nicks are deep enough that you'll need to grind them away before you can do any finer honing. You set the blade to the stone, press the pedal with your foot, and feel the wheel begin its familiar, gritty rotation. A mainstream fact. Medieval soldiers rarely treated their weapons with the reverence modern collectors imagine. He sets it down by your stool, careful to keep the crank handle free of tangles. The second mercenary sets his short sword beside you, crossing his arms over his chest. "We ride before dusk," he announces, as if you might be inclined to delay them for sport. It may not be a king's blade, but it's useful, necessary, and sometimes that's enough. The mercenaries watch, arms folded, faces taut with impatience. If it's made of iron, someone will bring it to you eventually. You've seen it before. Some men can stand the thought of anyone else having control over their weapons, even for a few minutes. In a few minutes, the mercenaries will be back, and the air will fill with the screech of steel against stone. You keep working until the fracture is gone. When you quench the cauldron, steam billows up around your face. "Fetch the whetstone," you tell him, "and check that the grindstone is clear of grit." He darts away to obey, eager for any task that sounds important. One of them carries a battered longsword over his shoulder. You can smell stale ale and sweat long before they speak. A quirky tidbit you recall from a passing friar. Some claimed iron was a living thing with its own spirit. He doesn't care that the edge could chip from rough handling. They never do. You set the mended pot aside to cool fully. The apprentice's face lights up as he inspects your work, his fingertips hovering just above the still warm iron. A sudden commotion drifts in from the lane hooves clattering, voices raised. You step to the doorway in time to see a pair of mercenaries swaggering past, their swords hanging low at their hips. One of them catches your eye and grins. "Smith, we've blades need sharpening before we ride on," he calls. You nod, though inwardly you sigh. You never relish dealing with mercenaries. They're quick to anger and slow to pay. But refusing them is a good way to invite trouble you can't afford. The men vanish around the corner, probably to slake their thirst at the alehouse before returning with their weapons. You turn back to the apprentice. You hear the apprentice rattling around in the back, the scrape of stone on wood as he wrestles the whetstone free of its crate. Still, when you look at the cauldron cooling on your bench, you feel something close to satisfaction. You draw a long, steadying breath and step to the grindstone, testing the pedal with your boot to be sure it spins true. Until then, you savor this brief hush, a moment's peace in a day that has no end. The quiet doesn't last. A few heartbeats later, the mercenaries are back, swaggering through your doorway like they own the forge. Sharpen these, the taller one demands, setting his sword across the anvil with a metallic thud that makes you wince. You nod once and lift the longsword to inspect it. You want the bend straightened, you ask, holding the blade up so he can see it. The mercenary squints, then shrugs. You motion the apprentice to bring the grindstone closer. Without replying, you rest the longsword across your knees and test the edge with your thumb. Sparks spray in thin arcs as the edge meets the wheel. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths doubled as armorers in every village, or whether those trades were kept separate in most regions. In your experience, the distinction doesn't matter. You pause the wheel to check your progress. The edge looks cleaner already, though the bend remains. You set the sword on the anvil and fetch a wooden mallet rather than a hammer. Steel on steel is too risky. It could leave fresh dents or snap the tip outright. The sword quivers with each blow, and you feel the mercenary's eyes boring into your back. At last, the bend yields, easing back into a straight line. You sight along the blade, satisfied. His companion pushes the short sword toward you, as if you might decide to change your mind and refuse the work. You take it without comment and set it to the wheel. Your arms ache from the grinding, and the air tastes like scorched iron. Still, there's a small satisfaction in knowing you've yet to fail any who come to your door, no matter how sour their moods or blunt their blades. You watch them go and exhale a breath you hadn't realized you were holding. A quirky tidbit you once heard in a smoky tavern. Some men believed striking a sword across the anvil while swearing an oath would bind a spirit to it. You set the whetstone aside and flex your fingers, working, feeling back into the joints. You don't say so aloud, but you suspect the only spirits these blades carry are the ghosts of chickens pilfered from village barns. You can already tell it's going to fight you. Plowshares always do. They're built to endure rocks and roots, but when they fail spectacularly. You steel yourself and reach for the next piece of work. You brace the blade carefully, find the weak point in the bend, and tap with steady, measured force. You'll need to heat it almost to sparking before it's pliable enough to weld. You've never tried it yourself, but on days like this, you wonder if a pinch of superstition might be worth the trouble. The apprentice's face is flushed, though he doesn't look away. That, at least, is a good sign. If he can stand to watch, he might yet have the patience for this trade. That means the forge must be stoked to a level most people would find unbearable. You motion to the apprentice to prepare extra charcoal. He scurries off, eager to be useful. Some insist most training was informal, with boys learning by repetition and scolding. You suspect the truth lies in the middle. The edges begin to slump and gleam, and you know it's time. The crack flinches under the impact, narrowing almost imperceptibly, you imagine. To him, it must look like magic red-hot metal mending itself at your command. But you know better. It's no spell, no secret knowledge, just sweat, timing, and an acceptance that your own strength will never feel like quite enough. You strike again and again, each blow coaxing the iron closer to wholeness. You draw it out with the tongs, the weight testing your arm as you cross to the anvil. Every step feels measured, deliberate, as if the air itself resists. You learned with a mix of both and a fair amount of bruised pride. You don't. You've salvaged worse. A mainstream fact. In many villages, a broken plowshare could mean a lost season's harvest. Even nobles understood you didn't leave farmers waiting if you could help it. You help him tip it into the forge's gaping mouth, then take up the bellows yourself. The roar that follows is almost a living thing, pressing hot air against your cheeks. You return to the grindstone and finish honing the edge, smoothing away the last scars of whatever reckless adventure the mercenary inflicted on it. When you're done, you wipe the blade down with a cloth and set it across the anvil. Your sword, you say simply. The relief is sharp but fleeting. Your body has grown used to this rhythm. Work, ache, rest, repeat. You sometimes wonder if you'll still hear the phantom ring of hammer on anvil long after you laid down your tools for good. He picks it up, tests the edge against his thumb, and grunts approval. The apprentice wipes sweat from his forehead and shoots you a questioning look. You nod toward the bucket of water. He takes a grateful gulp before offering it to you. Outside, the sun has crested the eaves, and you can feel the forge heat mingling with midday glare. You sip, savoring the coolness on your tongue. They clink against the wood, sounding too light for the labor you've spent, but you don't argue. You've learned that collecting what you're owed from men with swords rarely ends well. When you finish the short sword, the mercenary tosses a pair of coins onto the workbench. They leave without another word, boots thumping across the threshold. The forge feels calmer without them there, as if the fire itself has unclenched. There's still a pile of hinges and plowshares waiting for your hammer, and the sun shows no sign of slowing its climb. One more repair, you think. Always just one more. You cradle the next project, plowshare cracked nearly in two and study the jagged line running through its middle. The apprentice lingers by your elbow, eyes darting from the broken iron to your face, as though waiting for you to declare it hopeless. You run your thumb along the crack, feeling how deep it goes. While he works, you set the plowshare aside and stretch your back, rolling your shoulders until something pops. The apprentice returns, arms straining under the weight of the charcoal sack, a quirky tidbit you learned from a traveling smith. Some blacksmiths swore by sprinkling dried nettles in the fire to ward off gremlins that caused cracks. The heat builds until the forge glows white at its center, and you slide the plowshare deep inside. Sparks leap up, vanishing into the rafters. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths had formal apprenticeships as structured as guild records suggest. You watch the iron closely. You set the plowshare in place and lift your hammer. The first blow lands true, ringing through your palms. The apprentice watches, transfixed. You pause to return the plowshare to the forge. As the iron soaks up more heat, you take a rag and wipe your face. It feels almost out of place against the hush inside your workshop, where every sound is measured and necessary. The iron gives up its resistance in the end, settling into a single, unbroken peace. Steam swirls around you, and you close your eyes in the brief illusion of coolness. You feel something loosen in your chest, an invisible tension you hadn't realized was there. The sweat leaves streaks of soot across your skin. You've long since stopped caring how you look by day's end. Outside, voices drift by, children shouting, a woman laughing. When the plowshare is ready again, you draw it out and hammer the crack flat for the last time. But he looks so hopeful, so certain that you possess some hidden wisdom that you just nod. Experience, you say softly. Master, he says carefully, do you want me to bring in the broken gate latch? The day is only half spent, and your shoulders already feel as if they're packed with gravel. You give a great deal for a cup of ale and a seat by someone else's hearth. But you know you last 10 minutes before thinking about all the jobs you left undone. You nod, and he disappears into the yard to fetch it. No doubt he was hoping to watch you work the ornamental curls. You almost smile. Let him master nails and rivets first. If it was a blade, you'd always have sharp profit. The blade flexes under your hammer, each stroke sending up tiny flecks of scale. The apprentice stands nearby, holding the quenching bucket at the ready, though you won't need it just yet. If it was a nail, you'd be forever patching other men's mistakes. The forge, as always, doesn't care what the clock says. It only knows hot and cold, pliable and brittle. The question catches you off guard, and for a moment you have no ready answer. You think of the days when you were his age, dreaming of travel and bright chords, and stories that never mentioned the ache in your hands. You try to remember what your first piece was, a hinge. You think useful, but unglamorous, like most of your work. When the color reaches that perfect yellow-orange, you pull it free and lay it across the anvil's horn, refining the curve with practiced taps. It's not glamorous, but it's the sort of work that matters most. Without tools, there's no harvest. Without harvest, no bread. It's bigger than he is. Wrought iron twisted into a decorative curl that was never meant to be practical. Did you ever want to be anything else? You eye it with a sigh. Some noble's fancy, no doubt, built to impress rather than endure. You quench the plowshare with a hiss so loud it drowns out the rest of the world. One of the hinges has snapped clean, leaving a ragged edge that will have to be refitted. You run your finger along the break, feeling the softness in the grain. Whoever made this didn't temper it properly. You suppose that's good fortune for you. Bad iron fails faster, and failed iron means more work. The blade is pitted with rust, and you suspect it's been left out in the rain more often than not. You slide it into the coals and return to the bellows, pumping a steady rhythm until the metal blushes red. When you set the mended iron aside, the apprentice dares a small question. How did you know it wouldn't split? You take the chance to lean against the workbench and breathe. You've seen enough pretentious scrollwork come through your door to know that even the humblest lord likes to show off when he can afford it. A thin stream of sunlight has crept across the floor, highlighting the fine grit of iron filings and ash. It drifts on every draft, no matter how you sweep. A mainstream fact. Medieval forges were never truly clean. The air itself was part smoke, part dust, part memory of everything that had been made before. You consider telling him the truth that you never really know, not until the work is done. And maybe you think that all any of this really is. Learning when to trust that the iron will hold even when it looks as if it can't. The apprentice watches you as though he's trying to memorize every motion. You can tell he's building his own private legend of the Forge One, in which the blacksmith is always sure, always right. You almost hate to think how disappointed he'll be the first time he sees you fail. You leave the plowshare to cool, feeling the echo of each hammer strike thrumming in your wrists. The forge's glow has settled into a steadier burn, no longer demanding fresh fuel every quarter hour. The apprentice breaks the quiet. You take the moment alone to rub the heel of your palm across your forehead. When the boy returns, he's dragging the latch behind him like a dog on a chain. You lift it to the workbench. Historians still argue whether decorative ironwork was common in small villages or mostly confined to cities and great estates. You set the latch aside for later. It will need a longer heat, and you'd rather finish simpler repairs before tackling something so finicky your apprentice looks disappointed. Instead, you pick up a cracked sickle from the pile farm work, waits for no man's pride, a quirky tidbit you once heard from an old farmer. Some believed the first tool a blacksmith made in a new forge determined whether the shop would prosper. The sickle is ready. You ease it onto the anvil and begin tapping out the worst of the warps. Outside, the village is quieter now. The noon meal keeps most folk indoors. You envy them their rest. You work until the sickle edge lies straight again, then lift it into the coals a second time. The apprentice ventures another question. Master, he hesitates, then tries again. You pause, hammer in hand, but you also think of how it feels when iron yields under your hammer, how every finished piece carries a memory of your own strength. No, you say, finally, not really, and you find you mean it. You set the sickle aside to cool and watch a curl of steam rise from the blade. There's something calming in the sight proof you've done the job properly, proof the iron has been persuaded for a little while to behave. He's quiet, which you don't mind. Some questions don't need repeating. You can almost pretend it's resting too, though you know better. Soon it will be hungry again, a mainstream fact. A forge left to die mid-workday wastes more than fuel. You lose precious time rekindling it, coaxing the temperature back to a level where iron will listen. That's why you keep it fed, even when you're between jobs. You take a rag and wipe the sweat from your brow, feeling the crust of soot that never seems to wash off entirely. The idea was to bind the house's spirit in place and keep misfortune away. The iron darkens first to a sullen red, then begins to brighten at the edges. How do you know, he asks quietly, when it's hot enough? You ease the bellows into a slow, steady rhythm, watching the heat crawl into every crevice. You've been asked to perform such blessings more than once, though you never much believed in them. The apprentice backs a step. He's learned enough not to hover when hot iron moves. Still, if a tap of your hammer gives people peace, who are you to refuse? Too hard, and the scrollwork will crumple. Too soft, and the fracture won't seal. For just a heartbeat, you let yourself feel the tiredness in your bones, the way your hands throb from holding the tongs so long. You suspect it's the most important part. Then you draw a breath and lift the latch again, ready for the final shaping. Another piece done, another day nearly spent. It's never perfect, but it's close enough to satisfy both your eye and your conscience. The forge crackles softly behind you, and the last glow of daylight drapes itself across your workbench. The fracture is sealed now. The hinge moves without complaint, and the scrollwork still looks suitably impressive. A mainstream fact: in many medieval households, a latch like this was the first thing visitors noticed. It mattered less that it worked perfectly than that it looked like proof of wealth and taste. For the first time in hours, you hear your own breathing more clearly than the hammer's echo. The forge hums behind you, and the hammer's rhythm blends with your heartbeat. Even the way it sounds when you lift it tells you. You catch his uncertain expression. You'll learn, you add, because you remember how hopeless it felt once to imagine ever understanding. He's been at your side since dawn, and you suppose it's no surprise he's ready to be done. You remember being his age, thinking the day would never end, and that your master was made of something harder than bone. The apprentice lingers close, still digesting your answer. The forge flickers in the corner, embers settling in lazy pulses of heat. You give him a nod of approval. He's learning to think ahead, a skill every blacksmith needs more than any fancy hammer. The apprentice clears his throat. "Master," he says, nodding toward the latch, "do you want me to fetch more charcoal before you start that one? It's fine work, you grant, that though fragile in all the ways that matter least to the noble who ordered it. A gate latch like this proclaims status to every passerby, ever mind whether it survives the first hard winter. It feels like the day has run away from you, but you know it always does." You nod, though you won't need it until the last shaping. The iron must cool slowly at first, or the stress will undo all your work. There's never enough daylight in a blacksmith's life. You trace the fracture in the hinge with your thumb, feeling the softness along the break. You feel the heat deepen around you, wrapping your shoulders like a too heavy blanket. For a moment, you close your eyes and simply breathe. Whoever forged this last was more concerned with impressing eyes than enduring hands. While he goes, you turn to the latch, running your hand along the decorative iron scrollwork. Historians still argue whether ornamental iron was a sign of wealth or just vanity. You suspect it's both. When the apprentice returns, you help him tip the fresh charcoal into the forge. Sparks dance up in a brief golden shower. A quirky tidbit you once heard from an old cooper in some villages. You set the latch into the forge mouth, the flames licking along the ornate curls. The apprentice watches too, a line of sweat tracking down his temple. You don't look away from the latch. You see the color, you say, but you also feel it, smell it. When the latch glows, the right hue like old embers stirred back to life. You lift it free with the tongs and set it across the anvil. You begin working the hinge with light, deliberate taps. Outside, the afternoon is sliding toward evening. You can see long shadows creeping across the yard, the light turning golden on the worn stones. The apprentice offers the quenching bucket when you finish the first passes. You set the latch aside and rest your hammer across your knee. This is the part no one ever sees in the stories, the slow, tedious work of making sure something beautiful can also last. When the latch finally settles into its finished form, you let out a slow sigh. You set it gently aside to cool, feeling the forge's heat fade into the quieter warmth of the evening. You stand for a moment, letting the hush settle. The apprentice shifts from foot to foot, restless but trying to hide it. You lift the newly mended latch, turning it slowly in your hands. A breeze pushes through the doorway, ruffling your hair, carrying the scent of hay and the faint sweetness of evening baking. "Master, should I cover the charcoal?" he asks, hesitant. You glance at the pile near the forge, noting the way the breeze is stirring ash into the air. You nod. I tuck it under the canvas. For an instant, you imagine you could simply walk out, leave the forge behind, and never lift a hammer again. The sky is streaked with purple and gold, and the village is finally quieting. A few chickens mutter in their roosts. Someone is singing a lullaby, her voice thin but steady in the warm air. Most do, at least for the first few years. While you wait, you pull a stool to the doorway and sit where you can watch the light fade from the yard. You rest your elbows on your knees and feel, not for the first time, the ache that never quite leaves your bones. But the thought doesn't last. You wouldn't know what to do with your hands. But you see the worry in her eyes. She can't grind grain without that latch. No grain, no flour, no bread, ridged with old burns, too strong for any other trade. Even in the dusk, you can tell it's a piece that was never built to last. Still, you think it has lasted longer than the man who first fitted it to the mill door. The village settles by slow degrees, as if everyone has decided they've worked enough for one day. A mainstream fact. Medieval life was marked by a rhythm as sure as the seasons: labor, meal, rest, prayer. You suspect it hasn't changed as much as the scholars like to think. That's the thing about iron. It doesn't care who holds it, only that someone will. Maybe that's just the hour your muscles weary, your eyes gritty with the soot that never truly leaves. But you know better than to stop now. A promise made at sundown is still a promise in the dark. You look up to see the miller's wife hovering, her hands knotted in her apron. The iron darkens, then begins to bloom with color, shifting through every shade between ash and sunrise. For a moment, you allow yourself the quiet fancy that the forge is listening. To content, to witness your final work of the day. You ease the bellows, just enough to keep the embers awake, each breath of air coaxing a brighter glow. They'd swear an old hearth could refuse to burn properly for anyone else. You set it on the anvil and begin coaxing the worn edges back into place. A few small repairs remain: bent nails, a broken clasp butt, nothing that must be finished tonight. When she's gone, you set the latch on the workbench and feel the familiar tug of tired satisfaction. The forge is down to a deep, pulsing glow, not yet dying but no longer demanding all your strength to keep alive. For once, the heat feels companionable rather than oppressive. You believe it. No matter how clean you scrub, the forge always leaves its mark. The apprentice clears his throat. As he moves to obey, you take the chance to step outside and stretch your back. You rub your palms along your apron, feeling every nick and callus. When you step back inside, the apprentice has finished his chore and stands uncertainly, as though expecting you to announce some new task. You think it's simpler than either. A boy stays because he wants to know what it feels like to be the master of something, even if it's only a chunk of stubborn iron. The boy's shoulders sag in relief. Go on, get your supper. He mumbles thanks and slips out the door, leaving you alone with the forge's last embers. Historians still argue whether apprentices were bound by contracts or by need. You take the bent nails from the bench and set them in a small pot near the coals. They'll reheat easily, nothing complicated. The forge behind you is quieter now, but the air still carries its warmth. When the nails are ready, you straighten each one with a few quick taps. It feels almost ceremonial, this last small task to close the day. A shadow moves in the doorway. You could tell her to wait until morning. You have every right, you nod. Leave it with me, you say. I'll have it ready by sunrise. She exhales, gratitude softening her face. The forge, the hammer, the endless line of repairs. It's never finished, but in that, there's a kind of comfort. You rub a thumb along the edge of the millstone latch, feeling the groove where the iron has worn thin from years of daily strain. You set it aside for a moment, flexing your fingers to ease the stiffness in your knuckles. You hear laughter drifting down the lane, the last of the children chasing each other home before their mothers call them inside. When you finally lift the latch again, it feels heavier than it should. You set the latch carefully into the coals, easing it into the heart of the fire where the last heat waits. Behind you, the night settles in earnest. You can hear an owl in the trees beyond the yard, and the rustle of leaves as the wind begins to rise. A quirky tidbit you once overheard from a traveling tinsmith. Some believed the forge itself grew attached to a smith who served it well. The latch is ready. You lift it with the tongs, feeling the satisfying weight, the heat humming in your hands. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths worked longer hours than any other tradesman. You have your own opinion. The work ends when it ends, and not before. You pause to set the latch aside, letting it rest while you stretch your shoulders. Your arms are trembling, but you know that means you've given the day everything it asked of you. You lose yourself in the motion strike. Check, adjust, strike again till the shape feels right. You imagine your neighbors inside, tucked around their hearths, the scent of stew and baking bread softening the night. You envy them a little, but you also know you wouldn't trade places. The forge has its own kind of comfort. Outside, the wind has picked up. You can hear it worrying the shutters of nearby cottages. When the iron has cooled enough, you pick it up again for the final shaping. You'll see this latch again. You'll mend it again. And so the rhythm continues. You imagine him sitting with his family, describing every detail of the day in a voice bright with importance. It's an odd thought that, to him, all this is still new and unfolding mystery instead of a daily grind. You consider banking it now, letting it die until morning. But before you can decide, you hear footsteps crunching across the yard slow, deliberate. You know who it is before you even look up. The latch yields under your hammer in small, grudging increments, a mainstream fact. Blacksmiths often owned fewer tools than most imagine. A good hammer, a pair of tongs, a hardy for the anvil, those were enough to shape almost anything if the smith knew his trade. The rest was patience, and you suppose a stubbornness no iron could outlast. The forge hums behind you, low and steady, as if approving. You watch each dent smooth out, each flaw disappear, and think how this piece of iron will keep the mill door fastened for another year, maybe two, before it comes to you again. You find a small satisfaction in that thought, not permanence, but the promise of return. It's a rare moment of stillness in a day that has offered precious little of it. You let your eyes drift over the tools lined up along the bench, each one scarred by years of use, each one familiar as your own hands. At last, you quench it. The steam rises in a billowing cloud, carrying away the last tension in your shoulders. You set the latch on the workbench, laid out beside the day's other triumphs, small, necessary, and enough. You ease onto your stool and let your hands rest in your lap, feeling the ache of 100 blows, but also a quiet pride. And in that hush, you realize you wouldn't trade this life for any other. You stay seated a little longer than usual, listening to the forge's slow breathing and the soft creaks of the cooling iron around you. The apprentice is gone now, off to whatever supper awaits him. You lean forward, rubbing a thumb over the polished edge of your hammer. The forge has begun to settle into embers, the glow turning softer, the heat less insistent. The miller himself appears in the doorway, cap in hand. He nods once, eyes on the latch, cooling on your workbench. "Can't thank you enough," he murmurs. "Would ve lost half the week S-flour if that door wouldn't T-shut. My wife said you'd have it done," he says, voice low but threaded with relief. You nod back and gesture for him to step inside. He crosses the threshold, hands working the brim of his cap. "It's mended," you say simply. You don't bother to dress it up, no need. The work speaks for itself. You've seen a bit of that here over the years, men too proud to speak in the lane, who will nod to each other across your threshold. He hesitates, then draws a small purse from his belt. You can hear the faint clink of coin inside. He sets it on the edge of the bench. You take the iron poker and spread them wide, encouraging them to die. It's a ritual as old as the trade writ, turning each piece to its place, making sure no ember clings to catch the workbench alight in the dark. The moon has risen, painting the packed earth silver. The fabric is stiff with sweat and soot, but it's yours, a badge of belonging. The village lies quiet, every cottage tucked behind shuttered windows. You feel the hush in your chest, deeper than any exhaustion. The cot creaks as you sit up, rubbing the stiffness from your neck. For a moment, you wish you could lie back down just for an hour, but you know the forge won tea light itself. You check the bellows last, running a hand over the leather to feel for cracks. They'll hold another season, you reckon, maybe two. A part of you hates to see it, like closing the eyes of an old friend. "For your trouble," he says, and you can tell it costs him to part with it. "Straighten it," you say, watching his hands on the tongs. His grip is better now, steady, confident. He lifts the iron into the forge without flinching. You feel a small surge of pride. You've never seen proof of it, but you like the notion that a tool could carry a little hope alongside its weight. Maybe you think he'll make something of himself after all. He offers a quiet "Good morning, master," and sets about clearing the workbench without prompting. The fracture runs deep, a clean break that will need careful welding to hold. You remember the farmer who brought it, swearing he'd inherited it from a grandfather who served in some distant war. A sword with stories, he called it. You suppose all iron holds stories. If you look closely enough, you don't mind. Learning comes as much from watching as from doing. You nod, satisfied. Each day, he's less the clumsy boy who first stepped through your door. Enough to buy a new sack of charcoal, maybe some oats for the mule. As the metal yields, you feel the familiar rhythm return. Strike, check, adjust, strike again. You take a moment to stand in the doorway, breathing the cool morning air before it turns heavy with heat and smoke. The process feels almost sacred, this quiet bargain between your hands and the fire. A few plowshares to be mended, a barrel hoop to be reshaped, and most daunting, a sword to be reforged. You run a hand over the blade, feeling the jagged fracture near the hilt. This one will be no quick repair, a mainstream fact. Blacksmiths were often called the keepers of the flame, and you understand why. Without it, Nothing else follows. The sky is only just beginning to pale, and for a heartbeat, you let yourself enjoy the hush. You suspect it's as much about instinct as skill. One day, you look at a lad and see a smith instead of a student. You roll your shoulders, feeling how heavy they've become. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were respected because of their skill or simply feared because of the forge's mystery. You think it's simpler. People respect what they need. You nod again, and that seems to ease something in his face. You watch him go, feeling a quiet sense of closure. Another piece of work delivered, another need met. You pick it up and weigh it in your palm. A quirky tidbit you once heard from the village priest. In some places, a blacksmith's forge was considered a neutral ground, a place where debts could be settled and quarrels put aside. The miller inclines his head once more and backs out into the night. You turn back to the forge. The coals are nearly out now, their light no brighter than fireflies in the gloom. The air cools almost at once, the heat that has pressed against your back all day finally retreating. You take up a rag and begin wiping the tools one by one. When everything is in order, you stand in the doorway and look out across the yard. You step back inside long enough to hang your apron on its peg. With one last look at the forge, cold now, but never truly lifeless, you pull the door closed behind you. Tomorrow, you think, always tomorrow. You wake before dawn again, though your bones protest with every motion. The workshop is dark, the air heavy with the smell of old embers and iron filings. You light the forge carefully, feeding it scraps of kindling until the first flickers of flame catch. While the coals begin to glow, you set about inspecting the day's work. Your apprentice arrives, blinking sleep from his eyes. Historians still argue whether apprentices became journeymen by formal test or by the master's simple declaration. You point him toward the barrel hoop first. While he works, you take the broken sword to your own bench, a quirky tidbit you once overheard. In some villages, it was believed that reforging a sword also reforged the destiny of its bearer. You heat the blade in stages, working the fracture back into alignment with small, precise taps. Each blow is more persuasion than force. The apprentice glances over now and then, clearly wanting to watch, but too disciplined to abandon his own task. When the weld is ready, you quench the blade in the trough. The steam billows up around your face, damp and stinging, but you don't flinch. The fracture is gone, replaced by a seamless join. You know it will never be as strong as it once was, but it will hold if treated with respect. You've been burned too many times to startle now. A moment later, you test the edge with your thumb. Outside, the light has grown stronger. You hear the lowing of cattle and the rattle of a cart heading toward the market square. Another day unfolding, whether you're ready or not. You set the sword carefully on a folded cloth and glance over at the apprentice. A couple of hinges, a cracked cooking pot, a broken scythe blade. All of it ordinary, all of it important to someone. You can't say for sure. You only know that the day comes when the boy UVA trained becomes the man everyone relies on. You roll your shoulders, feeling the ache that never really leaves. A quiet certainty settles over you. You will finish this repair, and the next after that. Not because you must, but because you can. A mainstream fact in medieval life, most possessions were mended again and again, sometimes over generations. You suspect half the iron in this village has passed through your forge more times than anyone remembers. Children chase each other across the yard, their shouts bright against the drone of morning chores. The pull in your back is sharp, but you've grown accustomed to it. You watch his face as he lifts the hammer, his breath held in anticipation. His first strike lands true, not perfect, but good enough. You look around the forge at the worn bricks, the pitted anvil, the scatter of filings across the floor. No place else has ever felt more like home. You lift the hammer and begin working the crack back together, each tap precise, deliberate. No weakness remains. Another small triumph no one will remember except you, on maybe the farmer who relies on this blade come harvest. Sunlight pours through the doorway in a golden stream that catches every mote of ash in the air, turning the forge haze into a drifting constellation. You squint into it, feeling your eyes water as you ease the hinges from the coals. In that moment, you remember being exactly where he stands, watching an old man's hands shape iron, and thinking it was the closest thing to a miracle you'd ever seen. You can sense the apprentice watching from the corner of his eye. The apprentice takes the moment to rub his face on his sleeve. He looks as tired as you feel, though he tries to hide it. You almost tell him to go fetch water and step outside for a moment, but you know he'll only insist on staying. The hinges are warm, but not yet glowing. You turn to the apprentice. "Go fetch the rivets," you say. He nods, disappearing through the side door where the bins of small hardware wait. He knows better than to interrupt, but you can almost hear his questions. You've never been asked to bless a blade, but you suspect most people would rather believe in magic than admit how much depends on simple care. Somewhere, a dog barks, and you hear the distant slap of laundry against a washtub. All the sounds of a life you support in small, unseen ways. It's about tending the flame, shaping the iron, and teaching someone else to do the same. He's finished with the hoop and looks up, waiting for your word. You nod approval. "Good work," you say. His grin is quick and bright. You look around the forge at the tools lined up, the embers pulsing, the work waiting. It's all familiar, all necessary. And even in your weariness, you feel something like gratitude. You feel the old heat settling across your shoulders, a familiar burden. Some days, you welcome it like an embrace. Other days, it feels like a reminder of everything this work has already taken from you. Because in the end, this life is not about grand gestures or glory. And for you, that has always been enough. The forge is fully awake now, the coals shining bright as the day pushes its way into every corner of the workshop. Today, you decide to see it as the first. The apprentice has started setting out the next tasks without needing to be told. The crack is clean but deep work that will demand your full attention. You nod to the apprentice, signaling that he can tackle the hinges while you handle the blade. He moves to his station, shoulders squaring with a focus you didn't see in him a year ago. You test the scythe blade's fracture with your thumb. Historians still argue whether apprentices in small villages ever truly became equals to their masters, or if they simply inherited the work by default. When the old smith hands finally gave out, you ease the scythe blade into the forge, watching as the crack turns dark, then begins to gleam in the growing heat. While you wait for the blade to heat, you glance out the doorway. The village is stirring in earnest now. A quirky tidbit you once heard from a traveling potter. Some believed that a scythe, blessed by a blacksmith, would never dull. The blade is ready. You draw it from the coals, feeling the weight shift as you cross to the anvil. The iron is pliable now, vulnerable. When the fracture is sealed, you quench the blade and listen to the hiss fade into quiet. You lift it free and test the edge. You set it aside, your hands already reaching for the next piece. For a moment, you allow yourself to straighten up fully. When the boy returns with the rivets, you help him set the hinge in place and guide his hands as he positions the first pin. You smile, though he doesn't see it. And here you are, decades later, on the other side of that memory. You press your palm briefly to the boy's shoulder, a silent reassurance, and turn back to your own work. Because in this trade, nothing ever really ends. The day rolls on, bright and pitiless. They glow a dull orange, not quite ready, so you rest them on the edge of the hearth to hold their heat while you catch your breath. You can respect that. Stubbornness is the only trait that matters in this work. You pick up the scythe blade you finished earlier, running your thumb along the cooled seam where the fracture used to be, smooth, clean, and strong. It's satisfying in a way that never gets old, proof that you can still make something whole again. No matter how worn it was when it came to you, you nod, motioning for him to bring them to the anvil. He looks at you, eyebrows raised in a silent question. You nod once. Go ahead. He does, carefully, tongs held steady, the way you've drilled into him since the first week. A mainstream fact. Scythes were as vital as plows in a medieval village, especially during harvest. You don't do it yourself, but as you watch the boy work, you think maybe he'd like to believe such things are real. You don't have to correct him as much this time. When he lifts the finished piece, he studies it with wonder, as though it's become something finer than a simple hinge. You let him have the moment. He's earned it. A cracked blade could ruin an entire field's yield. If you didn't catch it in time, you heft it in both hands. It's not heavy, but the shape makes it awkward. You know this repair will take most of the afternoon. You think of the farmer who left this one with you. You shake your head gently. Watch. First, you say, you'll have your chance. Again, you tell him. He breathes out and hits it a second time. This one truer. You guide his wrist with 2 fingers, showing him how to angle the hammer so the metal flows evenly. You've mended this one before twice, in fact. You shift the kettle, striking along the seam in measured intervals. Each tap sends a little vibration up your arms, reminding you how many thousands of times you've made this motion. The woman who owns it always pays what she can, pressing coins into your hand with a soft apology for how few they are. You know what the iron looks like when it's too hot, what it feels like when it's cooling too fast, what it smells like when it's about to fail. When it clears, you lift the pot and inspect the seam. Smooth, tight, no visible weakness. You allow yourself a small breath of relief. You can't explain it all. You just know. You never mind. You'd rather see the kettle whole again than watch her cook over a fire with nothing to hold her stew. The iron takes time to warm, the crack disappearing into the glow, until it becomes part of the whole. In here, there is only the steady pulse of heat, the rhythm of your heartbeat, and the knowledge that you can still do this. This isn't a blade or a plowshare. You can't bully the metal into submission. Practice, you say, and respect. That knowledge will come in its own time after enough long days, with sweat stinging his eyes and a forge that seems determined to defeat him. You have to coax it, easing the iron together without warping the curve of the pot. You feel your own breathing slow as you settle into the work. He concentrates so fiercely that you can see the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth. You feel the old satisfaction settle in your chest, this moment when something broken comes closest to becoming whole again. You tighten your grip on the tongs and lift the kettle from the coals, carrying it to the anvil in a smooth, practiced arc. You suppose, to an outsider, it probably is just an endless string of repairs and replacements, but you know better. Each piece carries a story. Each mend is a small promise kept. He'll be back tomorrow, hopeful and worried in equal measure. You'll be able to tell him it's ready. The apprentice shifts from foot to foot, glancing at the hinges. Master, he ventures. Historians still argue whether the daily life of a blacksmith was as monotonous as the records suggest. You set the hinges flat on the anvil and position the first rivet, gesturing for the boy to take up the hammer. His strike is tentative. You almost laugh, remembering how your own first swing was the same, more a question than an answer. The hinge flattens under the blow, the rivet beginning to spread. A quirky tidbit you once read. In some towns, blacksmiths were thought to forge luck into the iron if they whispered a blessing during the final strike. The second hinge goes more smoothly, his confidence growing with each tap. You set the hinges aside with the scythe blade and turn your attention to the last item in the queue, an iron kettle with a ragged crack along its base. The apprentice draws a breath, clearly hoping you'll let him tackle it. He doesn't protest, just steps back, his gaze locked on your hands. You set the kettle in the forge, easing it into the center of the coals. Outside, the noise of the village ebbs and flows, voices rising, carts rattling past, dogs barking at imagined threats. Still make something useful, still teach someone else how. You close your eyes a moment and let that be enough. The kettle glows brighter, the seam of its fracture turning pale as the iron surrenders to the heat. The apprentice leans forward, eyes wide. You set the kettle on its side and begin tapping along the crack. Your hammer strikes, almost gentle. A mainstream fact. In many medieval homes, an iron kettle was often the most prized possession, handed down through generations. The forge hums behind you, a soft roar, like an old friend clearing his throat. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths truly understood metallurgy or simply relied on intuition passed down through repetition. You suspect it's both, the apprentice asks, voice hushed. How do you keep from cracking it worse? You smile faintly without looking up. He nods, though you can tell he doesn't fully understand yet. You quench the kettle carefully, steam rising in a twisting veil that hides everything for a heartbeat. A quirky tidbit you once heard in a tavern. Some believed if a kettle cracked 3 times, it was cursed. You've never believed in curses, but you also don't discount how often iron behaves in ways you can't quite explain. Think you could do that? You ask, not unkindly. His cheeks color. Someday, he says, almost a whisper. You set the kettle aside to cool. The apprentice lets out a breath he was holding, and you glance at him sideways. Good, you reply, because that's the only answer worth giving. Outside, the day is edging toward evening. The sun has slipped lower, and the shadows stretch across the yard in long blue streaks. Their still light enough for one more task, a handful of nails to shape before the dark settles in. You hear a rooster crowing, though it's long past dawn, and a woman calling for her children. In the distance, the mill creaks to a halt, the last grain of the day ground into flour. The ache is different, now less an enemy, more a reminder that you've earned this quiet moment. Together, you work in a hush that feels almost sacred. You wonder if he'll dream of hammers and iron the way you did at his if he'll ever understand how much of this life I senti about the metal at all. You pull the embers into a mound, covering them with ash to keep them smoldering till dawn. The skin is thick and ridged with old scars, but it still remembers every tool, every angle, every lesson. The thought is oddly comforting. You may not have much in this world, but you have that, a mainstream fact. Blacksmiths rarely let the forge die completely. You'd go on tending the flames, unseen, until the last brick crumbled. A warm heart makes it easier to coax flames back to life come morning, a small mercy you're never too proud to accept. You work steadily, shaping each nail with a care that belies how small they are, but you've come to think that's the point. Enough to buy more charcoal, more iron, maybe a little barley flour if the market isn't dear. You never expect more, and you rarely get it. The fire never truly goes out, and neither do you. A good nail can hold a roof against the wind. A bad one can bring a house down. The cracked plow blade propped by the wall. The iron straps for the cooper's barrel. You turn to see the cooper himself in the doorway, cap clutched in his hands. The cooper vanishes into the dark and reappears a moment later, a cracked barrel hoop balanced on his shoulder. You take it without complaint. "I'm sorry to trouble you," he begins, voice low, "but the barrel can't wait. We've got ale ready to spoil. The bucket handle with a hairline split. Small jobs, but each matters to someone." You bank the forge a little, giving yourself space to work without the full heat pressing against your spine. You've stopped wondering. You know it in your bones. When something breaks, they come to you. When something must endure, they trust you. That trust is heavier than any hammer. He stands awkwardly by the bench, not sure whether he's dismissed or needed. You nod once, wordlessly telling him he's free to go. He hesitates. He always doesn't, then murmurs, "Good night, master." You can smell smoke from the cottages, mingling with the sweet dampness of cooling earth. You stand in the doorway, the forge behind you and the quiet lane before you, and feel the day ease from your shoulders. Still sound, still serviceable, like you, in a way, not as supple as once, but unbroken. You gather your hammer and tongs, feeling the familiar pull in your shoulders. You stand in the doorway and watch the dusk gather, feeling something close to contentment. The apprentice sweeps the floor while you finish every scrape of the broom, punctuated by the ring of your hammer. And when the last nail is set aside, you rest your tools and let the forge fade into a steady, glowing hush. The forge's glow brushes the back of your neck, a reminder that the day isn't quite done. It never really is, because tomorrow the fire will rise again, so will you. You close your eyes for a moment in the doorway, letting the night air cool your face. The apprentice has finished sweeping the floor, now a patchwork of soot stains and clean cobbles. "Good night," you answer, and watch as he slips into the dusk, the soft scuff of his boots fading down the lane. Inside, the forge sighs in a final gust of heat, and you begin your last ritual, banking the coals. You set the poker aside and rub your palms together. You walk the workshop one last time, laying your hand on each piece of iron, waiting for tomorrow on unspoken promise that they won't be forgotten. Historians still argue whether the blacksmith was the true heart of a village. A quirky tidbit you once heard from a wandering friar in some towns. It was said that if you died with a forge still warm, your spirit would never quite leave it. You checked the bellows, running your palm along the worn leather. Outside, the night has thickened into something close to true dark. There is no grand victory waiting in this work no moment when you set the hammer down for good and call it finished. You gather up the day's coins, modest payment for long hours, set them in the strong box under your workbench. As you close the lid, you hear footsteps, again soft, hesitant. You almost smile. Of course, there's one more task. There always is. You nod for him to bring it in, because this is the life you chose. Or maybe the one that chose you. The life where no night ever ends cleanly, no forge ever truly sleeps. And in that, you've found something you don't need to name to understand. You ease the barrel hoop onto your workbench, feeling the faint tremor of fatigue in your arms. The iron isn't heavy by itself, but the weight of the dave, every hour UVA stood before the fire, settles on your shoulders like an old debt come due. He's a good man, and you know he wouldn't ask if it weren't urgent. It could mean losing precious ale or grain, sometimes the difference between a winter survived and one endured with empty bellies. You remind yourself of that as you lift the hoop, inspecting the split along one edge. You nod once, and that seems to ease the tension in his face. I'll have it done, you say quietly. The cooper shifts from foot to foot, cap still in his hands. A mainstream fact. In a village like yours, a cracked barrel hoop wasn't a small inconvenience. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were truly the linchpin of rural life, but you've seen it too many times to doubt. The split gapes for a moment before you lift your hammer. The iron cools faster than you'd like, and you have to return it to the coals twice before the seam finally softens enough to yield. You let the iron rest and straighten your spine, pressing a hand to the ache along your ribs. The cooper watches you closely, and you see a flicker of guilt in his face. Each time you lift the hoop back to the anvil, you feel the pull in your back deepen, but you don't slow. Some work simply has to be finished before the day can be called done. The first blow lands true, ringing out through the workshop like a promise. You feel the tension in the cooper ease, though he says nothing. You watch the color closely, every shade between dull red and bright orange, carrying a different story about what the metal is ready to do. When something fails, it ends up in your hands, trusted to you, because no one else can make it whole again. The knowledge that no matter how many times something breaks, you can be the one to set it right again. You've been here so many nights like this, long after the village has gone quiet, long after your hands should have stopped. It's a peculiar kind of peace, this hour after the last job is done, when no one is waiting at the door and nothing demands your urgency. The forge glows low behind you, warm but no longer fierce, like a loyal dog curled by your heel. You set the hoop gently in the forge, easing it into the coals with a practiced motion. A few bent nails swept into a corner, scraps of iron too small to salvage but too useful to discard outright. You run your fingertips along the handle of your oldest hammer, the one your master gave you the day you were declared ready to work on your own. The wood is worn smooth, the iron head pocked with tiny pits, but it still strikes true. It comes when it comes. The iron hisses where cold meets heat, the fracture disappearing in a wash of ruddy glow. A mainstream fact. Medieval blacksmiths saved nearly every offcut and leftover. Even the smallest piece could one day become a washer, a rivet, a patch. You've seen more than one apprentice learn that lesson the hard way after tossing something useless onto the midden heap. You suspect it's a mix of both. He nods, almost shy, and slips into the night without another word. You've never named yours, but sometimes you think you know them as well as you know your own hands. No give, no weakness. You set it down gently and turn to face him. It'll hold, you tell him. Relief softens the lines around his mouth. For a moment, the only sounds are the steady roar of the fire and the occasional creak of cooling beams overhead. Outside, the wind has picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying the clean scent of autumn on its breath. You glance out the doorway at the waning crescent and almost laugh. If the moon's thin tonight, so be it. The ale will stay put, or it won't, and superstition won't change the iron's nature. Behind you, the cooper shifts again, trying not to stare. You glance over your shoulder and nod toward the stool by the door. Sit. You say it'll take a little time. He hesitates, then lowers himself gratefully, resting the cap in his lap. You work the bellows in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The forge brightens with each gust, coaxing the iron toward pliability. A quirky tidbit you once heard from a tinker. Some believed a Cooper-S barrel would always leak if the hoop was mended on a moonless night. When the hoop is ready, you draw it from the fire and set it on the anvil. You work in steady taps, closing the fracture bit by bit. When you finally quench the hoop, steam billows up, softening the lamplight into a drifting haze. Didn't mean to keep you so late, he murmurs. You shake your head. It's the work, you say simply. You lift the hoop again, testing the seam with your thumb. Historians still argue whether the blacksmith's reputation was built more on skill or simply the endurance to outlast every problem brought through the door. The cooper counts out a few coins more than you expected and sets them on the bench. You stand alone in the hush, the forge banked low, the day's last task complete. You press your palm to the warm surface of the anvil, feeling the last heat leaching into your skin. And even now, you know you wouldn't trade it, because this is the work, the mending, the making. You rest both hands on the anvil and let your shoulders ease down, the ache in them settling into something closer to acceptance. For a few breaths, you simply stand there, feeling the hush, but the peace never lasts long. It's not in your nature to leave things untended, and you turn at last to survey the day's debris. Stray filings scattered underfoot, you gather them into a wooden bin, every clink a reminder that nothing here goes to waste. You check the rack where your hammers rest, laid out in descending order of size. Each has its own scars, its own memories. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths named their tools out of sentiment or superstition. A soft scuff at the doorway interrupts your thoughts. You look up to see the apprentice standing there, shoulders hunched, cap twisting in his grip. "I know you said I could go," he begins, voice low, "but I thought you might want help closing up." You study him for a moment, noting the tired smudge under his eyes, the soot streaked across his cheek. He's too young to have learned how to hide exhaustion. Together, you douse the last embers, steam curling around you in damp wreaths. The forge hisses its protest, but you know it will be ready again in the morning. It always is. You think about that sometimes as you bank the coals, wondering if the fire remembers your work better than you do. You nod once, feeling something almost like pride. The quiet between you feels companionable, two pairs of hands moving in the same rhythm. The forge is asleep at last, the anvil resting, the hammer silent. You glance at him, weighing whether to say anything more. In the end, you just lay a hand briefly on his shoulder. The sky is clear, stars shimmering faintly through the haze of smoke rising from chimneys. Each day, each strike, each mended tool is a small victory against the relentless decay of time. The forge door closes behind you with a soft creak, sealing away the last warmth of the day. You'd be surprised how many forges stood near wells or streams to keep workers and fire both hydrated. Good work today, you tell him. He glances up, surprised, then straightens under the praise. Fetch the bucket, you say, and he moves at once, relief flickering across his face. Life goes on beyond your walls, families gathered around evening meals, children lulled to sleep by whispered tales. He sets it down carefully and wipes his hands on his tunic. Thank you for today, master, he says softly. Then, with one last glance at the sleeping village, you turn back inside, the cool air giving way to the lingering warmth of the day's labor. You envy their warmth, their rest, but the forge is your hearth, and the anvil your companion. The chains clink softly as you draw it up, the splash echoing faintly in the night. You drink deeply, savoring the coldness that floods your mouth and soothes your parched throat. Each one tells a story, silent but insistent. You wonder how many hands before yours have held them, how many sparks have flown from their strikes. A mainstream fact, many medieval tools were passed down through generations. Their value more than metal was memory. The quiet feels heavier now, the kind that fills the spaces where clanging hammers once sang. You pull your coat tighter around your shoulders, the scent of soot and iron clinging stubbornly to your skin. You recall your own beginnings, how every day felt endless, every lesson hard-earned. You think about the years it took to steady your hand, to learn to listen to the iron instead of forcing it. The leather is stiff with old sweat and scorched patches. You run your thumb over a burn mark near the hem souvenir from the first time you thought you could catch falling iron barehanded. You still feel that lesson when the weather turns damp. You take a rag and begin wiping down the tongs, and the boy joins you without being told. A quirky tidbit you once heard from a passing pilgrim. Some believed that when a forge went completely cold, it dreamed of every blade and nail it had ever made. Tomorrow will bring more work, more fire. Are you ready? When the last tool is cleaned and returned to its peg, you hang your apron on its hook by the door. The apprentice stands awkwardly beside you, as though waiting for permission to leave. Thank you, master, he whispers. You watch him cross the yard, his steps lighter than before, and feel a quiet certainty that someday he'll stand where you do now, tired, content, and unwilling to leave, even when the work is done. You step into the dark yourself, closing the door behind you, and though you're weary, you know you'll be back tomorrow to wake them all again, because, in the end, this isn't just labor. It's the life you chosen, the life that chose you in return. Oh, you step outside into the cool night air, the village cloaked in quiet shadows. Your shoulders sag under the weight of exhaustion. But there's a strange comfort in the ritual, the knowing that you've done what you could. You make your way to the well at the edge of the yard and lower the bucket into the cool, still water. A mainstream fact. Water was as precious as fire to a medieval smith. You hear the distant bark of a dog and the murmur of late voices from a nearby cottage. The apprentice appears behind you, carrying a small bundle of firewood. You nod, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're learning well," you reply. He nods, determination shining in his eyes, despite the fatigue. "Yes." You share a brief smile, the kind forged in shared toil and unspoken understanding. You help him stack the wood near the forge, ready for morning. You close the door gently, the forge waiting patiently for the dawn. And with that, you allow yourself to rest, knowing the fire will be waiting unchanged, unyielding, eternal. You settle back inside the workshop, the air thick with the fading warmth of the forge. Your gaze drifts to the wall lined with tools, hammers, tongs, chisels, worn and waiting. The apprentice lingers nearby, watching you with the quiet patience of youth, still learning the rhythm of this life. A quirky tidbit you once heard whispered in the village tavern. Some smiths claimed the anvil held the echoes of every hammer strike ever made upon it. If you listened closely enough, you could hear the voices of the past ringing through the metal. You like to believe it. You pick up your hammer and run your fingers along its handle, feeling the familiar grooves worn by decades of use. You raise it slowly and bring it down with a soft thud on the anvil, a gentle punctuation to the day's end. Outside, the village sleeps under a blanket of stars. The forge may be dark, but its spirit hums softly in your bones. Tomorrow will come with new tasks, new challenges, and the same unyielding fire. You settle onto your stool and close your eyes, letting the quiet wash over you. The coals from last night still glow faintly beneath a bed of ash, promising life once again. You rouse the embers with a quick stroke of the poker, watching as the orange flames leap eagerly to greet you. The life of a medieval blacksmith is harsh and unrelenting, but it is yours. There's a comfort in routine, a quiet assurance that whatever the day holds, the forge will be your constant companion. You appreciate that now more than ever. You know it to be truage. Strike releases a little of the day's burdens, forging resilience alongside steel. And in that, you find a strange kind of peace. You hear the calls of merchants, the laughter of children, and the distant toll of the church bell. The forge hums steadily, a heartbeat beneath it all. Your work shapes the rhythm of the village, though few stop to think about the hands behind the iron. You catch yourself watching him more than the iron, noting the way his brow furrows in concentration, the set of his jaw as he mimics your motions. You start with simple task-shaping nails, straightening hooks, patching hinges. The hammer falls rhythmically, each strike a steady drumbeat against the anvil's cold surface. You think it depends on the day and the temper of the man. You awaken stiff and sore, the familiar ache settling deep into your muscles. But the forge calls, and you know there's no resting yet. You laugh, knowing full well it's nonsense, but the legend adds a spark to the long hours. The forge's fire begins to soften, the intense heat mellowing into a warm glow. And you'll be there, hammer in hand, to guide him through it all. You look over at the apprentice, knowing he's come a long way today. The morning light seeps through the small window, casting long shadows across the floor. You can see the wonder in him, that same awe you once had. You reach for the bellows and begin pumping, coaxing the coals back into a fierce blaze. The fire responds eagerly, flames licking hungrily at the iron nestled within. He struggles at first, but you offer gentle guidance. You pause briefly to wipe it away, the coarse rag leaving streaks of soot across your skin. His hands move with a confidence born of experience, though there's still a flicker of uncertainty beneath the surface. The apprentice does the same, and you share a tired smiler silent acknowledgement of the day's demands. Historians still debate how structured medieval apprenticeships truly were, but you believe the best lessons came from patient hands and hard work. You pull on your leather apron, heavy and stained, and step toward the hearth, a mainstream fact. Medieval blacksmiths often kept their fires burning continuously during busy seasons, knowing that a cold forge could waste precious hours to rekindle. It's a tale of stubbornness and discovery, of hands that refused to let go until the iron obeyed. He's quiet at first, eyes fixed on the flickering flames. You sense the weight of expectation on his young shoulders, the desire to prove himself worthy of the craft. The apprentice joins you, hands tucked inside his tunic to ward off the chill. You hand him the bellows, showing him the steady rhythm that keeps the fire alive. You begin preparing the day's tasks, gathering iron, sorting tools, and checking the anvil's surface for cracks. A quirky tidbit you remember: some smiths believed that hammering out their frustrations on iron was as much a spiritual cleansing as a physical one. As the sun climbs higher, the village stirs to life. You glance at the apprentice and nod. It's time to begin. The day stretches out before you like a long, unyielding road. The apprentice follows your lead, matching your pace, his hands learning to move with purpose instead of hesitation. A mainstream fact: medieval blacksmiths were often responsible for everything from horseshoes to household tools. The forge's heat rises, heavy and insistent, and sweat trickles down your face. You tell him a story as you work, something your master once told you about the first smiths who tamed fire and metal. He listens quietly, eyes wide. Historians still debate whether blacksmiths were revered or feared in their communities. A quirky tidbit you share: some believed that a smith's hammer could summon lightning if swung hard enough. The afternoon wanes, and the pile of repaired tools grows. Tomorrow, he'll face new challenges, new frustrations, but also new victories. As the afternoon sun dips lower, the forge's heat wraps around you like an old cloak, comforting and relentless. You turn to the apprentice, who's been meticulously organizing the tools for the day's next round of repairs. You hand him a battered horseshoe to reforge a task that once would have seemed daunting to him. He takes it carefully, eyes shining with determination. You nod approvingly. A mainstream fact: horseshoes were essential to medieval life, protecting the village's vital workhorses and war horses alike. Without you, these animals would struggle across the rough terrain, slowing every journey and every harvest. The apprentice fits the iron into the forge, the glowing heat transforming the cold metal into a supple form ready to be shaped. You watch his posture straighten, the way his muscles flex as he raises the hammer for the first strike. You offer guidance, your voice steady but patient. "Strike here," you say, pointing to the thickest part of the shoe. Sparks fly, and for a moment the workshop feels alive with possibility. Let the iron tell you how hard to hit. You smile at the thought of only that were true. He strikes, the hammer ringing clear. Historians still debate how much creative freedom apprentices were given, but you believe the best learning comes from trust and a steady hand guiding when needed. A quirky tidbit you share: some smiths believed horseshoes carried protective magic, keeping riders safe from harm and misfortune. A mainstream fact. Many blacksmiths took pride in the orderliness of their workspace, believing that a well-kept forge was a sign of a careful craftsman. You set the finished horseshoe aside, its shape perfect, ready to cradle a hoof once more, and with a willingness to learn from every mistake. You suspect he'll carry them with him through every hard day ahead. The apprentice wipes the sweat from his brow, breathing a little heavier now, but his eyes gleam with satisfaction. Each day in the fire-tempered not only metal, but character. He looks up, hesitation flickering across his face. Master, do you think I'll ever be as skilled as you? You've been forged by this work as much as you've shaped it. The forge's embers glow faintly, a heartbeat in the dark. The stars blink faintly above, and you think about the days to come, the endless rhythm of hammer and fire, the steady craft that binds you to this life. You stand in the doorway, the cool night air brushing against your face, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and earth. The village sleeps beneath a canopy of stars, silent except for the distant croak of frogs by the stream. You've lived that truth every day, each strike a testament to the endurance of human hands and spirit. You smile, knowing the truth is simpler. Your fortunes, like your craft, are forged slowly, patiently, with every careful blow. The horseshoe takes shape beneath his hammer, gradually curving into the familiar crescent. You think of the lives touched by your work, the farmer, whose plow will cut deep again, the rider whose horse is shod true, the family who will cook their meal in a pot you've mended. Tomorrow, the fire will call again, and you will answer. You catch yourself feeling proud, not just of the shoe, but of the smith in training, who's becoming something more with every strike. The forge roars softly, steady as ever, as the day fades into evening. The evening deepens, shadows pooling around the edges of the workshop. It's a familiar weight, the price paid for a day spent shaping iron and time alike. The hammer, the anvil, the fire, they've been your steadfast friends through years of toil. You begin tidying up the scattered tools, arranging hammers and tongs back on their hooks, the worn leather handles telling stories of countless days like this one. The apprentice moves beside you, gathering scraps of iron and swept filings into a small pile. You pause, considering your answer. You remember your own doubts, the long years of trial and error, and the moments when the iron seemed impossible to tame. Skill comes with time and patience, you say, finally. In its steady weight, you find a kind of peace, a reminder that though the fire will dim tonight, it will burn again tomorrow. He nods slowly, the weight of those words settling in. A quirky tidbit you share quietly. Some smiths believed the forge was a place of transformation, not just for iron, but for the smith himself. You smile at the thought. It feels true. Outside, the village grows quiet under the blanket of night. You step outside for a moment, the cool air washing over your face, and you find comfort in the certainty of it all. The forge's embers glow low, casting flickering shadows across the worn stone floor. You take a deep breath, feeling the ache in your limbs settle into a quiet companion. A mainstream fact: blacksmithing was one of the oldest and most vital trades in medieval life, a craft that bound communities together through steel and sweat. You run your fingers over the cool metal of your hammer, its surface scarred but steady. A quirky tidbit you recall softly. Some believed that the final hammer strike each day sealed not only the work, but the smith's own fortunes, good or ill to come. You look out over the quiet village, the soft glow of lanterns twinkling like distant stars. This is your legacy, not glory or fame, but something steadier, quieter, life of purpose, hammered out day by day. You close the forge door gently behind you, the night swallowing the last light. Because this is the life you've chosen, because this is the life that has chosen you. Now, as the night deepens and the world quiets, imagine the soft crackle of embers fading to gentle warmth. Your hands, worn but steady, rest easy at your sides. Each moment of labor now melts into stillness, the weight of the day settling softly into peace. The forge's glow dims, wrapping the workshop in a calm embrace. As the stars drift silently overhead, feel the slow, soothing rhythm of your breath, steady and unhurried, like the patient pulse of the iron beneath your hammer. Let your mind drift, carried on the gentle hum of distant village life, the whisper of leaves, the muted steps of night watchers, the distant song of a lone owl. There is nothing left to do now but rest, knowing the fire sleeps but never dies. May your dreams be warm with the glow of the forge, gentle with the promise of new days, and quiet with the comfort of a life well shaped. Good night and sweet dreams.